In the summer of 1995, the labor issues bubbling under the surface of Detroit's newspaper industry burst to the surface. The ensuing strike would change not just the free press and the news, but also quite possibly the newspaper industry as a whole. We spoke with several direct and indirect participants in the affairs, and searched from that fateful summer through the legal end of the strike several years later in 1998. Their stories and insight into what would prove to be one of the lasting statements about the role of labor in the newspaper business, both then and now, were invaluable. In our allotted time, we cannot reasonably show everything that we gathered over the course of our investigations. We shall instead settle for a showing of parts of the interviews that we conducted in the past several weeks and months. It is, by necessity, an imperfect sample, but one we nevertheless believe demonstrates the depth and importance of this event in Michigan's journalistic history. Uncut clips of all of our interviews are available at our website. Thank you.
It's always about the money. If they say it's not about the money, it's about the money. Mostly we felt we were being underpaid. There had not been any raises for a while in the union contracts, and I would say that was the main issue.
What were the factors? I think the Gannett Corporation was interested in breaking the unions, and secondly, you had a lot of male hormones, male ego, male arrogance working on both sides of the equation, and that exacerbated the situation. So there was not a great deal of likelihood there was going to be a compromise rather than a strike when the negotiations started.
There's no question about why the strike started. The companies wanted a strike. The company's final offer included language that essentially said that after, it was a 3-year contract, and at the end of those 3 years, all pay raises would be determined by management on the basis of merit. If a union can't negotiate for wages, they asked us to accept major concessions in the previous round of negotiations, saying, look, if you accept these this time, we'll be much more generous the next time. Of course, we turn around and 3 years later are confronted with proposals that effectively would have met the death of our unions, hardly what any of us considered to be generous.
They wanted to impose conditions. That means the one side unilaterally put something into effect, and they wanted to go to a merit pay system, whereby people wouldn't all get the same raise every year according to the union contract. They would get raises, or a larger portion of the raises would be determined by management based on performance.
Because the union said, look, these guys have gotten together and they're not really competing on the business side, because the business side is a joint operation. They've got the joint operating agreement. I think for the first time in many years, they were assured of profitability. And the unions basically felt we'd like some of that for our work. And I think for the companies, they would have been thrilled to have eliminated the unions altogether.
If they'd waited another 10 or 15 years, they could have broken the unions anyway.
Well, the strike started in the evening. About 7 o'clock was the deadline, and the strike began. I was in the Free Press newsroom, and it began peacefully. People worked hard up till the last minute. Then at 7 o'clock they stood up and they left the building. There was no yelling, no commotion. It was very professional. And a picket line went up around the Free Press building and around the news building.
In some ways it was kind of festive. It was the summertime, so the weather was good. The trucks would drive in or out and people would yell and scream and maybe bang on the side of the truck and shake their fists.
Early on, their biggest problem was they didn't have enough personnel to put out much of a paper. They were using all their editors, and for the first week to 2 weeks, it was a little slipshod. But they got a paper out every day, and that was to them a major victory. They were never stopped from publishing.
We started producing one combined edition, and to us it felt as though the plan was for the Detroit News to just take over everything and just emerge from the strike as the only paper in Detroit.
Also, that actually they were thinking that this would end with Detroit being a one-paper town.
This was our impression. We were very paranoid, and we felt we were fighting the unions and the Detroit News for the survival of the free press.
The strikers started a weekly paper called the Detroit Sunday Journal. It was a tabloid-sized newspaper, and it was written by reporters and photos from photographers who generally covered those issues, those events, those communities before they were on strike. So there were some stories that related to the strike, but there were other stories about what was going on in Detroit or Hamtramck or Bloomfield Hills or Lansing.
I mean, it settled into a routine after a little while where we would come to work, we would get yelled at, we would do our jobs, put out the paper, and that act of putting out the paper was the thing that was really hard for unions. They were having a strike to prevent the operation of the newspaper, and we were not stopping. We kept making newspapers. We made them every day. I don't know if that first day's paper got anywhere, but we never missed a day of publication, and this was hard for the unions to take from the standpoint that they weren't really shutting us down. And I think other people said, well, what kind of strike is that if they're still in business?
Yeah.
One of the reasons, I believe fairly early on, that the strike was doomed was that about a month after we walked out, Gannett spent something like $1 billion, billion with a B, to buy another company, and Knight Ridder, which owned the Free Press, spent something like $100 million to buy another company. And I thought, well, if they've got between them $1.1 billion to buy other companies, they can just wait us out indefinitely, and whatever amount of money the Free Press is losing and the news is losing is relatively insignificant.
It was a long and tumultuous strike. I mean, a lot of very emotional for an awful lot of people. I think it did an enormous amount of damage to the city of Detroit. I think it actually did a lot of damage to the companies that ran the papers. And I think part of the proof of that is that Knight Ridder doesn't exist anymore. Emblematic of a very negative trend in American society that has been accelerated, an anti-union, anti-labor attitude in society that's been accelerating since the PATCO strike, it was 1981.
I think that the unions failed to understand the movement away from unionism in the country. They thought Detroit's special, Detroit's a different market. And the heads of the unions were arrogant, and some of the heads of the unions wanted to go out on strike. And I think that was a huge mistake.
What changed was the realization, as the strike continued, that it was a terrible idea to go on strike, because we and management had underestimated how long it would take to resolve, and the difficulty in bridging the gap and reaching some kind of conclusion.
They walked out at the worst time of year. Why would you walk out in early July when that's the time when the newspaper business is at its lowest?
There were people who went back to work within a few days of the strike. There were people who went back all across the spectrum. I went back after about 5 months because I realized the strike was not going to accomplish anything, and indeed it did not call you names, people would yell at you, call you scab, people who liked you, people that you liked. But everyone did what they had to do. I mean, I was on the picket line for 5 months, and then I was crossing the picket line. So it was hard all around for all concerned. It was sad.
I think one key event in all of this was when the company sent a letter, this is the Free Press now, sent a letter to all of its striking employees saying, please come back to work by, this Friday or whatever. Because after that, we're going to start hiring replacement workers because we have to get the paper out. We can't do this with expensive people we fly in from other cities and put up in hotels.
And what they did was they started to take us back piecemeal, one at a time, sort of, picking and choosing the ones that they wanted to as vacancies opened up, from the replacement workers left.
It became pretty clear that some people needed a letter to come back to work. They were ready to come back to work, but they didn't want to come back to work and be sort of criticized by their union brothers and sisters if they didn't have a really, really good reason for crossing the picket line. And for some of them, the threat that they would be replaced was a good enough reason. What wound up happening was when people said, I want to come back to work, if there was no vacancy for them, they had to wait until there was a vacancy, then they were called back from a callback list. So we stopped hiring anybody except striking or formerly striking union members at a certain point.
Well, there was a lot of division and bad feeling. Some of us didn't go back. Some went back earlier. Some went back after the guild said, well, we're kind of giving up on the strike. And there was a lot of resentment among the reporters who didn't go back against those who went back, particularly those who went back early.
In some senses, it has never completely returned to normalcy.
If a newspaper strike couldn't succeed in a heavily unionized city like Detroit, with a long tradition of strong unions, then it would be even less likely to succeed elsewhere. Many of the people who canceled their subscriptions to the news, the Free Press, or both, because of the strike, never resumed. Some of them switched to papers in the suburban communities like the Oakland Press or the Macomb Daily. Some of them may have bought the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Some of them simply didn't buy daily newspapers again. They got out of the habit.
Well, I think it devastated them in terms of their quality of the news product. Of course, I'm not sure that it was the strike that did that, or that it was the attitude of management toward the products that they were producing. I'm not convinced that they would have continued to be as good a paper. I think it was destined for them to go downhill, because the whole point, of the exercise, the whole reason the companies had provoked the strike was to cut costs, and their view of cutting costs was to get rid of a lot of
I know that bitterness, particularly in people who worked in Detroit, lingered literally for years afterwards. And there were people who were close friends before who didn't talk to each other for a long time as a result of being on opposite sides.
It drove people away from newspapers, and it did. A lot of people. I mean, you look at the circulation numbers for the Detroit papers now. They're a very small fraction of what they were.
It got very little for all that time. So yes, I would say it did weaken the position of labor at newspapers, and in fact, I believe this was the last newspaper strike in America, certainly the last significant newspaper strike in America.